Thanks, Kim, I think. Show and tell time for me. This is the book I wrote, Lost Airmen. I have to read the subtitle because it wasn't mine. The Epic Rescue of World War II Bomber Crew Stranded Behind Enemy Lines. I'll tell you about the perils of being published by a mainstream publisher as we move along. So, in fact, I'm going to start with that. So the talk will take you through the book, through the process of writing the book and publishing it. Oh, I thought that this mic would work. Oh, that's for you. Oh, got it. Gotcha. Well, then I can't pace, can I? All right. So I'll try to be careful of this thing. So now the subtitle was invented by the publisher. I had a little different subtitle. So it's not just a rescue mission, it's an epic rescue mission, in case you want to know. Not my idea. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. I was opposed to this cover, and I have nothing to do with it. The B-24s up there are nice. The whole scene below doesn't occur in the book at all. There is nothing even remotely like that happens in the book. It's about airmen who are shot down, get rescued by partisans, and most of them find their way home. Some are killed, some are captured. But there's no mortar, there's no bazooka, there's no nothing. And so the cover has nothing to do with anything. Don't ask me. So the book, as I said, is about, it is the first book that's been published that deals with airmen who were helped by the Yugoslavian underground, the partisans anyway. There's another book that many of you are familiar with called The Forgotten 500. And I know that the 449th had Greg Freeman as a speaker at their last get-together. I wrote this partially in response to that book because while it's called Operation Halyard, while that operation was important and rescued not exactly 500 people, it was 417, and I'm sure it was important to those 417 people. The Chetniks rescued far fewer airmen than the partisans did. The partisans happened to control a much greater portion of the country, and we can get into that a little bit later on. But there were over 2,000 airmen rescued by Yugoslavian partisans during the war. So their contribution to the airmen was far more significant. I focus on a group of airmen who gathered in a small town in modern-day Bosnia named Sanski Most. There are 13 crews involved, and I'll go through all that. So it's about how they got there, what their missions were about, how they got rescued, and sort of the fates of the airmen who didn't end up with the partisans. So it follows these 13 crews all the way through. It gives context. It tells you why they were in the air, the strategy behind their missions. Basically, when you're done with the book, you should have a pretty good idea of what all of the 15th Air Force was about at the time. Did a lot of original research. I was fortunate enough to find 40 of the 130 airmen involved and speak to them. Sometimes I reached them too late and I reached their families. Several of them had been interviewed by other people, but generally I had a really clear idea of what was happening by cross-referencing all those interviews. A lot of them published diaries and really importantly, the letters that they sent home. They weren't allowed to discuss their experiences with the partisans naturally when they told their families they were safe for security reasons, but still it gave us a lot of background on what it was all about. This is an image of the Air Force Historical Society in Montgomery, Alabama, where all the microfilm is housed, and was a significant resource for the research. So this is a little shout out to all the bomb groups here. There are 13 crews, 12 bomb groups involved, and practically every bomb group represented here except for the 98th, I think, and the 376th is featured in this book. So as I go through the bomb crews, each bomb crew has its own story, naturally enough, and each one gave me an opportunity to explore a different aspect of the air war. And I won't go through all these, the possibilities, but I start with my father's air crew. He's a pilot, and that gives me an excuse to talk about the training and selection process that all of your relatives went through. And so that by the time you're done reading about my father's crew's experience and their gathering, you know that each of these airmen went through a similar process, and that gives you the background to go through the rest of the book. Other chapters, two of my crews had B-17s rather than B-24s, and that gives me an excuse to compare, as everybody always does, the two airplanes, and everybody advocates for one or the other, and it's sort of a Ford versus Chevy kind of thing. I also have to give background on what was happening in Yugoslavia, which was probably the most challenging part of my research, because there's very little in English language literature about the war in Yugoslavia at the time. There's more now than when I began, but and most of it's still very partisan, small p partisan again. So as you know, it's a very fractious place, and so even current writings are sort of slanted one way or the other between the partisans and the heavily Serbian Chetniks, and you know, either one is a hero or one's a villain, and it's really hard to sort through the facts of the matter. And but there's a chapter in there that does that, and gives I think a pretty good summary of what was going on in the country at the time. I'll mention the immigrants. One of the interesting things I found in my research was that I think every the 13 air crews, all but one, had a foreign speaker in it, because we're a nation of immigrants, and there were generally languages that were useful on the ground once they got shot down. So remarkably, to me anyway, language wasn't a terrible issue. I mean, it was a barrier, but every airplane had a German speaker, a Polish speaker, a Czech speaker, or a Slovak speaker, and there were a fair amount of Italian speakers in Yugoslavia at the time. So if you had a foreign language speaker, you actually could get along pretty well on the ground. And the other thing that caught me by surprise is that practically all these crews, once they got to the ground, ran into an English speaker in the middle of nowhere in Yugoslavia. And the reason for that was that so many of them had traveled to the United States and worked in a Ford factory in Detroit, had learned English, and then moved back to Yugoslavia and retired. So there were English speakers all over nowhere in Yugoslavia. I'm a firm believer in maps and explaining things. I think so much of history is explained by geography. And what I'll point out is that the whole reason that Yugoslavia is key in World War II is its geographical location. You can see that Yugoslavia is surrounded by Axis countries. Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria are all in members of the Axis. So when Germany wanted to invade the Soviet Union, Hitler wanted to protect his southern flank, and that's why he invaded Yugoslavia. He also wanted to get towards Greece, where there was a strong British presence. There's not a lot of natural resource in Yugoslavia, so it wasn't important from that respect. It was important because of where it is. And again, this map shows why the 15th was doing what it did. And I want to tip my cap to Steve over there, who gave a great presentation earlier about what the 8th was doing. But you can see that the 15th could reach places that the 8th couldn't. And one of the main reasons there were two main reasons why the 8th or the 15th was created. One was because after Italy surrendered, the thinking in the AAF was that they might get better flying weather. Everybody knows that England has poor flying weather. They thought that they'd get better flying weather out of sunny Italy, which turned out not to be the case. The weather wasn't any better in Italy than it was in England. The other reason was that Albert Speer, who was Hitler's munitions czar, had placed most of the oil refineries out of the reach of the 8th because he didn't want them bombed. But he couldn't put them out of the reach of the 15th. So the main mission of the 15th was to get at those oil refineries, many of which were synthetic oil refineries. And some people might be surprised to learn that most of Hitler's oil at the time was synthetically produced through changing coal into oil products. And after the fall of Ploesti, Hitler basically had almost no natural oil. And so it was those synthetic plants that were manufacturing all of Hitler's petroleum products, and only the 15th could reach them. So the 15th played a huge role in the destruction of the Third Reich. And there's my father. That's where I began my research. I never intended to write a book when I started. I was just trying to research my father's story. And I realized as time went on that it might be of greater interest than just my family. He was shot down twice. The first time we thought was the big adventure because he was nearly killed. But as we meaning me and my siblings, as we went along, we realized that that was just kind of the warm-up to the real story, which is the Yugoslavian story. I include this slide because I want you to notice how young they look. We talked about that earlier, how they're all 18 to 22 roughly, and if you're over 25, you're an old man of the crew. This is them just as you're going to ship overseas. This is them 3 months later after only 11 missions of combat, and I think you can see in their faces that they've aged. You can see they look years older, and I just think that's extremely telling of the stress that these men endured. I just love this photograph. This is an image of my father's plane, the one that he lost when he went down in Romania, and just a terrific colorized image of planes from the 464th. That's yellow Howe up there, and V for Victor, also known as the Fertile Turtle, which was my father's aircraft. This is for people who have read the book. And this presentation, by the way, is designed mostly for people who haven't read the book. I'm going to throw a few things in there for people who did, who have already. And this was the line on the right is the one that shows where they went the first time they went down. My father was trying to reach Romania because he had seen people pass through camp that were being repatriated from Romania after the Russians had overtaken Ploesti and the prisoner of war camps that were there. He knew that there was an American mission in Bucharest, and he wanted to get to Americans. He didn't want to put himself in the hands of the Russians because the Russians had a bad reputation for the way they were treating Americans. Second time, the Air Force had a better idea of what areas of Yugoslavia were under the control of the partisans, and his navigator had good maps and knew where they should bail out. So once they got to a certain point, actually my father had a little argument with his navigator because he wanted to get closer to the coast. And navigator said, no, this is where it's safe and this is where we got to bail out. And it was wise because there were Germans farther to the south between Sansky Most and the Adriatic. And that's why they're behind enemy lines, because the Germans were retreating. They were all over the place. And this was one pocket of Yugoslavia where it was safe for the Americans to gather. This is also, this will help anybody who has family members who bailed out. So this illustrates how you would get out of an airplane out of a B-24. And it wasn't really all that easy to get out of a B-24. It was easy to get out of 17. So the best way was really just to bail out the bomb base. Or back here is basically a camera hatch for aerial photography. But no, it wasn't easy at all, especially in a damaged plane. And this is the same thing for a B-17 crew. At least here you had a good exit out of the nose, whereas in a B-24 you had to go out through the nose or basically the nose wheel hatch, and there was a danger of getting stuck in the struts, as some of them did. And in fact, in the book, there's a couple instances where guys got hung up on rivets or struts that were in the way, and one guy had to be kicked out of the plane basically because he's hanging there by by the straps of his harness. This is an image of a map that they all carried. This was part of their escape kits. And this was the sort of scale of the maps that they had to get out. So I also like this image because it doesn't just show the geography, it shows the topography a little bit too. So it shows you that those are the Alps up there, and these men were pretty close to the Dinaric Alps, which are pretty rugged mountains. And if any of you have ever been to upstate New York, they remind me a lot of the Adirondacks. That's roughly the ruggedness of those. It's not the Rockies, but they're pretty rugged mountains and very sparsely populated, just like the Adirondacks still are. So one of the little things I go through is what daily life was like in Italy. And I just think these are fun images. I left out the ones with the latrines. But the latrines were they were out in the field. There was they weren't outhouses, they were just benches. And the Italian peasants would come by every now and then and laugh at them for sitting there. I just think this is a fun image. Harry Hogeveen is one of the airmen I write about, and he took these photos and sent them home to try to describe how much fun he was having. He's having a duel and playing William Tell with one of his crewmates. Obviously, they're kidding. It just shows that the 44th is represented. One of my crews, actually two of my crews, landed on Vis. And Vis is an island off the Yugoslavian coast. It was held by the partisans. The British had an air base there where they had fighter aircraft that would periodically go out and raid in support of the partisans. And it also served as an emergency landing place for any of the heavy bombers that were too beat up to make it all the way across the Adriatic. One of the weaknesses of the B-24, probably some of you know this, is that it was practically suicide to try to ditch an airplane in a B-24 in water. B-17 would at least stay in one piece long enough for you to get out of it. B-24 would just fall apart. And you did not want to be in a B-24 and not make it all the way across the Adriatic. So if there was any chance at all that they weren't going to make it, they tried to get to Vis and land. And one of the little historical corrections that I make in the book is that Stephen Ambrose was wrong in the Wild Blue Yonder about the possibility of taking off again from Wies, because two of the 13 crews that I write about did that. And Stephen Ambrose's book says that if you landed on Wies, you stayed on Wies. Wrong, Stephen. Now, I'll ask some of you to. Some of you might be more visually acute than I am. I found this image on the internet. I think this is possibly one of my crews on Wies, and here's what they looked like. So if some of you are sharp enough to be able to identify these guys, I'd appreciate it. I'm still trying to figure it out. As I said, I go through the whole partisans versus Chetnik debate that still rages historically. Basically, as there's this fellow on the right, General Mihailovich, was chosen as the British initially to be their sort of their liaison in Yugoslavia, and he was one of the most famous people in the world at the time, and they basically, those of you who have read The Forgotten 500 know that that author advocates for Mihailovich and says that Churchill made a mistake in backing the communist Tito. I side with Tito. This is one of the towns that the men passed through, Drvar, which became Tito's headquarters. Tito was holed up there when, this is a picture taken by a British agent who was ensconced with Tito at the time. And there's a small part of the book where we talk about how the Germans tried to capture Tito in a raid called Knight's Move. It was one of the last German airborne operations of the war, and fortunately enough for me, they took photographs while they were trying to capture him. Tito barely escaped and lived to fight another day. This is an image of pre-war Sansky Most. This is the town where the airmen were sheltered. Most of them resided in the top floor of that building there, which was a municipal building. And that bridge had been destroyed by the time the airmen got there and was basically a Z. And that, went like that. And you could get back and forth across that bridge, but only if you were pretty young and athletic. That's Sansky Most today. I took this picture from the air, from a helicopter, and you can see that bridge is still there. The municipal building's gone, but that shows the geography of the place, and the reason that Sansky Most is there is because it's at a narrow part of the Sana River, and in fact, Sansky Most means Sana's bridge. So this shows why the airmen ended up in that town, and you can see that my brother created this map on the left, and it shows that the path of the airmen basically went right over Sansky Most, and you can see, so they go up to Blackhammer or Osweecom or wherever, get shot up, and only get so far on the way back, or they had intelligence like my father's navigator did that this was the safe place to go. There were two outliers there. I think that the one who went to Munich was trying to get over to Wies, and that's why I ended up in the neighborhood. And the guy who went to Linz, which is the second dot from the left, I think was actually lost. So this actually is more for people who have already read the book too. But one of the crews bails out over a marsh, which is up there. They didn't really know that the river had been swollen. It wasn't on their maps, and 3 of the men who bailed out drowned after they landed in their parachutes in this frozen marsh. The 2 pilots stayed in the airplane for this distance, and if they had held off in bailing these guys out just another 5 minutes, those men wouldn't have drowned. and they ended up bailing out over here, which is a good ways away. And that's one of my little mysteries that I'll never know the answer to, why the pilots had those men bail out in retrospect prematurely, and when they could have gone a little bit further and survived. There's a lot of mention of the rail system in the book. There was a rail network that had been built by the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, and it was the only way to get around the country. There were virtually no roads, and so you had these little trains. I think, that looked like this. They're wood fed. And whenever they went around, basically they'd go only so far, have to chop down trees to feed the engine and load in water, and then they could go another 10 miles, and then they'd do it again. And that's how they got around. I like this image a lot. This is two of the airmen with some of the partisans. Most of the partisans had no uniforms. This one fellow seems to, and so does the guy on the right. The guy on the right is the commander of the town, whose name was Despot Duchan. But there's the two airmen there, and most of the partisans just wore civilian clothes or often captured German clothes. In fact, some of the airmen are rescued by partisans who were in German uniforms and get a little nervous at first when they see the guys. And the only way to distinguish the partisans was because they all had garrison caps with red stars on them. Otherwise, there was no uniform, or barely any uniforms. So the men flow into town in two waves. My father was part of the first wave. 4 crews start there or get there, about 32 men, and the town can pretty much handle that. In the week of December 6th to 26th, or 10 days there, the 15th Air Force decided they were going to try to knock out the Reich's oil resources once and for all. Started what's been called, in retrospect, an oil blitz, and really stepped things up. And that's when a lot of the guys got shot down and ended up in Sansky Most. So there are a couple of ramifications of that. One is that the 15th, maybe some of you don't even know this, the 15th played a big role in winning the Battle of the Bulge, because it was the 15th that had knocked out the German oil resources, so that the Germans could not stockpile more than a couple days of oil supplies for their tanks. So, and they couldn't refuel them once they ran out of gas. So that's one of the main reasons that the offense failed, and it was because of you guys' ancestors, or some of you who are here, contributing to that effort. There are some British agents who show up in town. They're there to arrange for the rescue of downed airmen. There were British teams all over Yugoslavia doing the same thing, equipped with radios, and they would call to the headquarters in Bari to try to arrange rescues. Our guys were stuck in town here mostly because the airfield that was outside of town was flooded by fall rains, and the ground was too soft. And another reason why Sansky Most was used is because it's one of the few flat places in central Yugoslavia, and it's just all mountains, just like the Adirondacks. So when there was just no place to land even C-47s. So they all gather in town. They're waiting for a rescue by air because they can't get out by land, and they're surrounded. But they can't fly out because the field's too wet. So basically, they have to wait for winter to set in so that the ground will freeze, so that the planes can come. And then, of course, when the ground freezes, it snowed, and they couldn't get in anyway. This is one of, I'm allowed to have my favorites. This is one of my favorite airmen from the book. His name is Jan Roklowski, and he was an Olympic-level athlete, and I just think he has a terrific story. He was as you can see, a gymnast, but he was an Olympic quality gymnast, and he would have joined the 1940 Polish Olympic team if they had held the Olympics in 1940. He was that good an athlete, and so he spoke several languages. He could speak German. He had married a German-speaking wife in Poland, and eventually had to leave Poland because he was trying to help his boss, a Jewish jeweler, by transferring the shop into Jan's name to keep it from being confiscated by the Germans. And the Germans figured that out. He gets notice that he's going to be arrested, and he had to flee Poland, make his way across Europe, got to Lisbon, and worked up enough money to get back to America. He had been born in America, which is why he was drafted once he got here. Ends up in getting shot down over Yugoslavia. And he's one of the Marshall crew that bailed out over this marsh in Yugoslavia. Gets picked up by two Germans in a sort of a skiff, and his hobby was canoeing. He was an expert kayaker and canoeist. So these Germans are talking to each other, and Jan can understand every word that they're saying, and he's not letting on that he can understand them. He waits till he's near one of the islands in this marsh, and the Germans are wearing winter coats, backpacks. So he gets near the island, tips the boat. The Germans sink like rocks, and he escapes, and that's how he got out. This is another crew, the Kaiser crew from the 301st. They were a B-17 crew. I mention these guys because another interesting story here, I think, is that they had a bombardier who was Jewish, and he carried a dual set of dog tags, and he disposed of the dog tags with an H on it, H for Hebrew religion, and carried Protestant dog tags. And so he gets captured. The Germans never figure out that he's Jewish, so he escapes that sort of ordeal. And there he is. So he apparently he looked German enough to those. He's blonde, and to me he looks Polish. But Schwartz is German for black, so they assumed he was German, and never guessed that he was Jewish, and so he wasn't segregated like some of the Jewish POWs were when the Germans figured out they were Jewish. Eventually, as all these airmen gather in Sanski Most, they just become too much for the partisans. The Yugoslavian people were wonderful to our guys. They would give you the shirt off their back. Their culture is very big on hospitality. They would, if they were feeding an American, they might be feeding them a week's worth of food to them, and they were absolutely terrific. But still, it was too much for them. This is still a war-ravaged locality. Their little statistic is that the per capita Yugoslavia lost more people killed proportionately than any place in World War II except for Russia and Poland. So it gives you an idea of how desperate the situation was there, and it wasn't a rich country to begin with. And not only were was there fighting amongst between the underground and the Germans, but the various factions were fighting each other. There were Muslim militias, the Chetniks, the Ustashi, who would just simply kill you if they found you, and they were the puppet government of Croatia at the time. Not only that, but the partisans had their own code. They were communists, and they everything was supposed to be shared equally by everybody. And there's stories in the book about that. one of the problems that the Americans brought with them is they weren't just consuming resources, they were ostensibly rich, auspiciously rich, I should say. They each carried $48 in their escape kits in gold-backed American dollars, and I did some math. When you add up all the money that was in their escape kits, they at the conversion rate that they had at the time, basically they carried value equal to 1/10 of all of Croatia in their escape kits. That's how rich these Americans were compared to everybody else. So, and they had no concept of how much things ought to cost. They're paying basically American values when they should have been paying 3 cents for an egg. They were paying 50 cents for an egg. Blows the economy out of the water, causes inflation all over the place. Everybody starts saving their goods to give to the rich to sell to the rich Americans. This is not going over well with anybody. And eventually the Americans start figuring out, hey, I'm paying too much money, and this isn't good. But eventually the commandant in town basically told them, you can't do that anymore, and we're going to assign keepers, they were called, to shadow you around and make sure you don't spend money and destroy our economy anymore. The final crew that ends up in town is led by David Blood of the 485th, and Blood was kind of a wild character. He was one of the men who had landed on Vis and managed to fly out of there. He brings along with him, this is an image of Colonel Tom Have. I think I got this from Jerry. This is David, oops, wrong one. Oh, I can't. But anyway, David Blood's in that photo. I can show you later. In fact, he's in one of the posters that's in the hospitality room. This fellow here, Captain James Johnson, decides he wants to tag along on the mission. And he's one of the reasons that this makes such a terrific story is because every story needs a villain besides the Germans, and he was sort of a bad guy. And he tags along on the mission because he wants to increase his pay. So if you got flight pay, it increased your pay by 50%. So he flew a mission once a month so that you could get flight pay. And he's a captain. So he goes on this mission, gets shot down, and arrives in town and decides that because he's a captain, he's in charge. And the partisans just plain hated him. Because he shows up, he starts telling everybody what to do, and especially in the hospital. And anyway, they really get fed up with him. The partisans decide they've had enough. They're going to kick the Americans out of town. So they put him on one of these trains. After the 3 attempts to rescue them by air fail, so about 60 guys end up on getting shipped out on rail cars attached to one of these locomotives, and this is the last week of December 1944. You remember from the Battle of the Bulge, this is the most severe winter of the century in Europe, all over Europe, not just in Belgium, but in Yugoslavia as well. They get snowed in, they get stuck in the mountains, and they need to turn around and come back in the town. And the partisans are not happy about that. Finally, on January 5th, they managed to clear the airstrip outside of town. 3 C-47s show up, and the major in charge of the rescue operation decides that each plane can only carry 22 men. And that means 66 of the 84 men who are in town can go, 18 men needs to stay behind. The pilots who know better, because every pilot knew the specifications of every aircraft, they knew that the weight limit on the C-47 would have allowed all of them to come out. I think the major in charge was going by the book. He had instructions not to take more than 22 men because there would be 22 paratroopers. Each paratrooper would carry 80 pounds of equipment, hence, and they were at their weight limit. Well, these guys weren't carrying anything. There were maybe a few souvenirs. So they easily could have carried all these 84 men out, but the major decides, no, I got to leave 18 men behind. My father, being the sort of person he was, volunteered his crew to stay behind. I think partially because they'd been shot down before. I don't think they were in a hurry to get back into. They all assumed they would go back into combat, and I don't think they were in a hurry to do it. The major in charge decides or promises he'll be back the next day, and of course he never comes. The other reason that the doctor is the villain of my piece is that he decides that although step back, they had all decided democratically that naturally enough those who had been in town the longest should be the first ones to leave, those and those who were wounded. So the first plane carries out the wounded, and they all line up to leave basically in the order in which they had arrived. David Blood's crew had been the last to arrive, and by all rights should have been the ones to stay. Dr. Johnson says, "No, I'm a captain. I'm going." And not only does he decide he's going, but he takes a few of his buddies from Blood's crew and throws other guys off the plane. And when I interviewed some of these guys who were booted off the plane by Johnson 70 years later, they're still mad about it. Not happy. You can imagine. So this image here too is that's just your generic C-47 there. But that's for those who read the book, they did unload a Jeep. Those planes could carry Jeeps, and they unloaded a Jeep as a present to some of the British agents so they could get around the country. So that's sort of an illustration of what might have happened on the airstrip, although it would have been winter and there would have been snow all around, but it would have looked something like that. So my father and the other 18 guys, 17 guys need to walk out. And by now the Germans had mostly succeeded in retreating, and the path to the coast was maybe clear enough for them to go. Regardless, the partisans said, "You're going." So they give them an escort of about 10 guys, and led by a partisan lieutenant. And they're walking out, and basically it'd be like walking across the Adirondacks. They were 120 miles from the coast, and there's pretty much nothing there. They might find shelter here and there, but they're walking in the worst winter in history of the century across the mountains with only as much food as they could carry. So there's a story in the book of how they reach a certain point and they get stuck, they get snowbound in a blizzard. They find a cabin on the side of a mountain, actually 3 cabins on the side of a mountain, and they get stuck there. And the snow got so deep that they and the partisans had to go outside and clear the windows because they were afraid that they would be buried and suffocate. So that actually they needed to clear the windows to breathe. And there's a little story in there about how they had a pack horse with them, and the pack horse was stuck outside. And after a while, and the horse is neighing out there and protest against the blizzard that he's facing out there. And after a while, the Americans sort of look at each other and say, "Wait, we don't hear the horse anymore." And eventually the partisans bring in a stew for them to eat. And so they knew where that meat had come from, but no more pack horse. So, they ate it gladly. Eventually, though, they had to move on. They were out of food. They had to move on, blizzard or not. And 2 of the partisans had decided that they needed to move on to the next station anyway. There was an officer there with a with a satchel, probably full of some dispatches or intelligence that he thought was essential to move on. So he and another partisan tried to get to the next stop along the way and depart in the middle of this blizzard. A day later, one of them comes back, the assistant, and says, I can't make it. His leg is frostbitten, and it starts to turn black on him. And the Americans and the partisans are out of food, and they just have to go on, and or they're all going to starve or freeze to death. And basically, they made a decision. They just left the guy there because they couldn't carry him. They were in 6 feet of snow. They don't have a stretcher. They can't carry him, and they can't deal with him, and they just left him. And my father didn't remember that. It took, I think he had banished it from his memory, but other people did, including one of my most important sources. One of the guys kept a diary as he went along, and that's all documented. So, and there was just nothing they could do, and they left him, no doubt to either freeze or starve to death. But they did make it to the coast. That's what the countryside looked like from the air. I took that from a helicopter in Bosnia. So generally speaking, that's what the territory looked like that they passed through. So our main group of guys have gotten out and gotten back to Italy and are deloused and everything that happens when you get back to civilization. But some of our guys are still missing towards about 80% of the book in. And some of them had ended up with the Chetniks, and which is one of the reasons I had gone into the Chetnik versus partisan debate. And by now, the Americans had withdrawn all their aid from the Chetniks. They had withdrawn all their liaisons. And in fact, the last plane that carried the last men out left on December 27th. And these 4 men from Lieutenant Blank's crew are on their way there. They actually saw those planes leave, and they didn't realize that that was their last chance to escape. And so they're stuck there with the Chetniks with no way to get out. So these guys ended up with Mihailovich's men for the next 4 or 5 months, and they end up witnessing the destruction of the Chetnik army at the hands of the partisans, and are actually the last outsiders to see General Mihailovich alive. Later on, Mihailovich was about a year later. Mihailovich was captured, was convicted of treason in a show trial, and executed. This is an image of the coin that General Mihailovich gave to Harry Blank as he was departing. There were about 20 Americans in camp by then. There had been a few stragglers that had come in and been gathered up by the Chetniks. And as he said goodbye to them, Mihailovich gave each of these guys a British gold sovereign, which the British had given him earlier in the war as part of their effort to aid him. And he gave it to each of them, saying, basically, this will help you help buy your way out of the country. And so Harry Blank kept that coin, and that's an image of the coin that General Mihailovich had handed him as they departed. The book ends with my parents getting married. My father had met my mother while he was in training. He joked that he hadn't brought back and they were engaged. My mother had apparently told him that she had wished he had brought back his parachute the first time he was shot down. Not that he could have shipped it stateside anyway, but so he always joked that, well, he had to go get shot down again so he could get the parachute. And so she made her wedding dress out of the nylon that the parachute was made out of, and that story was in the newspapers and made the wire services and made news across the Northeast anyway. So that was their 15 minutes of fame. And that's more or less where it ends, as a happy ending. A few notes to myself here. I've got some typos in there. Parachutes. Billow, they don't bellow unless they're very noisy. 5 proofreaders missed, and me missed that one. So anyway, if you read the book, if you find any other typos, let me know. I'd appreciate it. The index isn't my fault. The publishers hired somebody to put together the index, and some of the families are a little ticked off that their relative isn't listed in the index. I've got a list of people I want to add to the index if it goes into a second edition or paperback, and I hope to fix that in the next edition. And that's it. I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any. Yes?
About the escape kits, I don't know a whole lot about that. I know that they would get sort of a silk map of where
They did.
the regions where they were, the target area and that kind of thing.
Yes.
But you mentioned the $45 for each.
48, yeah.
But what happened, for instance, when a plane is successful and comes back to base?
Oh, well, basically, yes.
That escape kit back in?
Basically, that's what happened. Yes, they were issued the escape kits the morning that they were taking off. Escape kits included a syringe of morphine, bandages, sewing needle, that money, which some of them were in $5 denominations, was way too much for Yugoslavia. And actually, they're about the size of a cigar box. I remember my father at his eventually had kind of warped and he threw it out. Maybe some of you have them in your family stock, but I thought it was kind of interesting that they had a syringe of morphine in them for an emergency like that. And yeah, and by the way, some of the escape kits were missing the money. That somebody had stole them from the supply room. So the guys bail out, they end up in Yugoslavia, and their kit has no money, which was not cool. Yes.
What was the dates that they were marching out?
They were walking out basically from January 6th for roughly 3 weeks. So it's January of 1945. Yes.
I received a book about a year ago from a writer, I'm not sure if he's a Serbian or a Bosnian, but it's called Broken Wings.
Yes. I discovered that actually after this book was published. I just discovered it since March anyway. And yes, there is one other book that deals with the partisans. So what I said earlier isn't exactly right. It's the first sort of book. It's the first book published by a mainstream publisher rather than self-published. That's out there. But yeah, Broken Wings is actually it's a real good book too. I recommend it. Anybody else? Yes.
Did you do much research on any of the missions that were over there, the personnel in the missions?
Yeah, I did. One of the challenges of writing the book is the fact that the same thing happens to each of the crews. There are 13 crews. Each of them goes up. Each of them has a target, and each of them bail out. But to keep the book interesting, I couldn't describe each bailout. I had to kind of skip through or otherwise it would get boring and redundant.
I actually was referring to like the British, missions on the ground.
Oh, them.
That they ran into.
That's not well documented. There are a couple books on that, and I can recommend some to you. And in fact, some of them are in the bibliography. But yeah, the British are still pretty circumspect about the agents that they had in Yugoslavia. There are a few books out there, and I have some idea of where where and when some of the guys were. And they had about 100 agents scattered all over Yugoslavia, and they all had code names, and Flotsam was one of them. The guys that helped my father were codenamed Icarus, randomly codenamed, but they came in teams of 2 or 3, usually an officer and an enlisted man who served as the assistant and radio operator. Yes?
One of your early slides depicted the circle from 8th Air Force and the circle from
Yes.
8th Air Force and how they overlap.
Yes.
It sort of sparked a curiosity question. I know the Russians used most of their aircraft tactically, but was there any effort whatsoever from a strategic effort from that corner, from east?
There were some mission. I didn't hear all of your question, but there were some missions that were based in England that went to the far reaches of the Reich, landed in Russia, and then came back after refueling. The Russians hated that. The Russians didn't want any part of, as was described earlier by Steve, it took a lot of logistics to get those planes in the air. It took spare parts, it took a lot of fuel, and you couldn't just send them there and fuel them up and bring them back. There had to be infrastructure there to handle it. And the Russians didn't want any part of it. They were paranoid about letting their allies in their country and seeing what was going on. And in fact, one of the interesting things about my father, the fact that he was behind Russian lines in Romania, he's one of the few Americans who were behind Russian lines and came back. The Russians didn't like it, and that's one of the reasons why he didn't want to go behind Russian lines the second time. He wanted to avoid the Russians at all if he could.
My question is, did the Russians have any strategic bombing?
No. They had fighters. They had a lot of fighters, and in fact, we sold them a lot of Curtiss Wright aircraft that were obsolete to us, but the Russians were glad to have them. And no, they did not have strategic bombers. I'll also add that part of the mission of the 15th was to support the Russians. They would, when they attacked rail yards, for example, they were trying to prevent stockpiles from going to the Russian front to fight the Russians. Yes?
You guys still have your mother's wedding dress?
I do. It's still hanging up in my study. And in fact, I wrote an article on it, and it appears in Western New York Heritage magazine. And someday I'm going to leave it to the Buffalo Historical Society. Yes?
So, I was wondering, did your dad not have to fly again after he walked all the way out?
That's a great question. He did not, although he thought he would. And in fact, I was the one who explained to him why he was sent home. He always wondered, but he was afraid to ask. He didn't want anybody to second guess their decision that they were going home. And in fact, the answer is, and some of the guys knew this while they were there, that the rule was that if you were missing for 42 days, you could go home. And in fact, one of the guys who walked out with my father had arrived in town later, had bailed out later, and he had been gone for a biblical 40 days and 40 nights, as they say, just missed the deadline, went back into combat, and was killed in action. So that's one of the sad parts of my narrative.
Captain Johnson make that rule?
Anything else? Anyway, I've got copies of the books to sell, and I'll be glad to sign them for you. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
One more question. How many days in total was your father away?
How many days? Actually, I don't think I've counted.
Add that up?
I think let's see, it's from December 2nd to January 23rd, so whatever that is. So it's probably over 50 days anyway. Yes? Yeah.
Did you ever find out what happened to
Dr. Johnson. I know that he was a pediatrician. So actually, that was one of the interesting pieces of research is to look at what flight surgeons did and what their role was. And it wasn't really so much to patch up wounded airmen as it was to diagnose combat fatigue. And the doctor was the only one on base who could ground somebody for combat fatigue. And Johnson, the book describes this, was famously a hard ass about it. And even though actually there was a crew who had been shot down, and a guy, one of the members of this crew had a piece of shrapnel in his skull, and Johnson still made him fly. So it just gives you an idea of that he was really tough on that sort of thing, and he just didn't believe in relieving people for combat fatigue. And I'll say this too: the Air Force was remarkably enlightened when it came to combat fatigue. Whereas the British had an ethic that if you got combat fatigue, it was like a moral failure, like you were a coward. The Air Force understood that courage was like money. If it gets spent on every mission, and after a while you'd run out. And that's why after X amount of missions, everybody got a week off, and they'd go to Capri or Naples or Rome. And I'm sure all these the airmen, if they served long enough, ended up in one of those places and sort of recharged their batteries before they went back into combat. So actually, they knew what they were doing. Anything else?
You gonna tell everyone what podunk town?
Yes, and yeah, it's remarkable that Terry said, or that Joe Sedlak, who's one of the airmen in my book who I interviewed, was a farmer from Hennessy, Oklahoma, and we're just sitting across the table from each other one day, and I mentioned Joe Sedlak, and it turned out that Kim lived within a mile of him. It's pretty interesting coincidence. Anything else? Yes.
I sort of know how much is your bet?
Oh, oh, to you, no, to you, $50. No, I sell them at my cost, which is $25, which includes the shipping to get them here, because it was expensive to get them here, but 25. Ready? Okay, well, thank you very much.